The bat came down hard, and the crack of bending metal tore through the street before anyone could breathe. Shards of chrome and glass skittered across the asphalt as the pickup rocked in place, its door crushed inward like it had been chosen. The HOA president screamed about community standards, gripping the bat like it was proof of authority. Red and blue lights flooded my driveway. Neighbors poured out of their houses, phones already recording. She didn't drop the bat. She didn't step back. "That truck is banned," she shouted at the officers. I warned him. My guest stood a few steps away, hands visible expression, calm, too. Calm for the chaos around him. He didn't argue, didn't explain, just watched. The officer asked for IDs. She handed hers over first, smiling already, rehearsing how this would end. Then the officer checked my guest's license. He paused, looked again. His posture changed as his hand moved toward the radio. She laughed once. "Go ahead. Do what you need to do." That was the moment this stopped being her street. Even though she still had no idea who she just targeted, she didn't wait for the officers to speak. She pointed. "Stand over there." The HOA president ordered, tapping the pavement with the end of her bat like she was marking evidence. "You're blocking the drive." One of the officers hesitated just half a beat. She caught it and leaned in. "This is private community property," she said. "We have enforcement authority." She pulled a folded packet from under her arm. Bylaws highlighted tabs sticking out like bookmarks in a courtroom file. She quoted sections fast, confident, as if speed alone made them law. Trucks were prohibited. Guests were not exempt. Aesthetics mattered. Property values came first. She turned to me only once. "You've been warned before," she said, though I hadn't. That was her trick. State things as fact, then move on before anyone could challenge them. Around us, neighbors stayed silent. No one corrected her. No one backed me up. That silence was her real power. She'd trained the street to look away. She finally looked at my guest's eyes, narrowing, measuring. "Visitors follow the same rules," she said. "Especially when they think they're special." That was the only crack in her mask. Not anger, not rage, control. She believed the HOA wasn't just a board. It was a shield. And as long as she spoke loud enough with enough paperwork in her hands, the law would bend to fit her voice. She had no idea how wrong that assumption was. The rule didn't come from a meeting. It showed up overnight, printed, laminated, taped to mailboxes like a warning no one had asked for. No trucks with open beds. No exceptions. By sunrise, bright orange violation stickers had already spread down the block. Windshields, tailgates, a delivery van that didn't even belong to a resident. I watched from my porch as the HOA president walked the curb, phone raised, snapping photos like evidence collection. She measured distances with her heel, leaned in close to driveways, lingered longer where she thought something might be wrong. She stopped at mine, looked, waited, looked again. Nothing. I didn't own a truck. I hadn't broken a rule. I stayed invisible. That didn't protect me. By noon, my phone buzzed with a courtesy notice about guest compliance. No incident listed, no date, just a reminder that violations would escalate. By evening, a neighbor asked if it was true that visitors couldn't park overnight anymore. Delivery drivers started calling instead of pulling in. One said he'd already been fined once and wasn't risking it again. Another canceled outright. The street felt tighter, quieter. She passed my house twice that week, slow, intentional. Once she smiled, not friendly, satisfied. That was when it clicked. This wasn't about trucks. It was about reminding everyone that entry into this neighborhood wasn't a right. It was permission, and she controlled it. The first official letter arrived 3 days later. Not addressed to me personally, just my address bolded like a target. It cited guest vehicle noncompliance and warned that continued violations could result in escalating fines, towing authorization, and eventual liens against the property. No photo, no timestamp, just consequences. At the bottom of the page beneath the board's letterhead, one name stood out. Elaine Mercer, President Brookstone Vale HOA. I read it twice. I'd never been warned. My guest hadn't been cited. And yet, the letter spoke like guilt had already been decided. When I emailed back asking which bylaw gave the HOA authority over visitors' vehicles, the reply came fast and final. All vehicles entering the community fall under HOA regulation. Hosts are responsible for compliance. No discussion, no appeal. I forwarded the exchange to a friend who worked in property law. His response was blunt. They don't have that authority. Not even close. But the board acted like the question was settled. Meeting minutes were quietly updated. The truck ban appeared retroactively referenced as if it had always existed. Neighbors stopped pushing back, not because they agreed, but because pushing back had become expensive. Fines appeared without warning. Tow threats followed. Silence returned. Thicker now, and Elaine stayed visible through all of it. Emails, walkthroughs, clipboards in hand. She wasn't hiding the system. She was daring someone to test it. The real reason surfaced by accident. A neighbor I barely knew caught me near the mailbox one evening and asked carefully if I'd heard about the redevelopment talks. I hadn't. He leaned closer, voice low. The HOA had been in quiet negotiations for months. Reclassification. A push to reshape the neighborhood into a restricted aesthetic zone. Language that sounded harmless until money entered the sentence. Mid-seven figures, incentives tied to property turnover, buyouts, resales, alignment. Trucks didn't fit the image. Neither did contractors or guests who didn't look like potential investors. The vehicle ban wasn't enforcement. It was pressure. Make life inconvenient enough and the right people would leave. Once enough properties turned over, the money unlocked. I felt it then, sharp and cold. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was strategy. I replayed the letters, the confidence, the way Elaine spoke to police like the law belonged to her. The speed at which rules appeared and consequences followed. My guest truck hadn't been a violation. It had been a test. And she'd chosen my driveway to run it. I didn't warn him. I didn't cancel the visit because now I needed to know how far she'd go when the paperwork stopped scaring people and whether she'd still swing when authority finally pushed back. I stopped arguing with the HOA. Instead, I called the county clerk, not to complain, just to ask a simple question: whether a homeowners association could legally regulate vehicles owned by non-residents parked temporarily on a homeowner's private driveway. There was a pause on the line, keyboard clicks, a second pause. Then the clerk said carefully, "No, they don't have that authority." I asked about towing, about fines, about liens tied to guest behavior. Each answer landed heavier than the last. No, absolutely not. She asked for the document. I forwarded the letter. A few minutes later, she called back. "This filing references a bylaw amendment," she said, "but there's no record of it being approved or recorded with the county." She read the signature line aloud. The same name, the same title. "That amendment isn't valid," she added. "And using it to threaten liens is serious." Serious was the word that stuck. I contacted a local attorney next, not to sue, not yet, but to understand exposure. He confirmed what the clerk had said and added something worse. If the HOA had knowingly enforced an invalid rule to pressure homeowners, especially with financial consequences, it crossed into abuse of authority, potentially fraud. That night, Elaine sent another email. Not a notice, not a warning, a demand. My guest's vehicle was expected to be removed immediately. Any return would trigger direct enforcement action. The language was sharper now, less polished. Desperation had crept in. I didn't reply. I forwarded everything, emails, letters, screenshots, to my guest. He read them quietly. Then he said, "Let's see how committed she is." The truck came back 2 days later, middle of the afternoon, broad daylight, no attempt to hide it. It rolled into my driveway slowly, deliberately, and shut off. The engine ticked as it cooled. The street noticed immediately. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open. I didn't say anything. Neither did my guest. We didn't have to wait long. Elaine appeared from down the block with purpose in her stride. Clipboard gone. Something else in her hand instead. A metal bat carried low, like she'd already decided how this would end. She didn't call the board. She didn't call a tow. She walked straight up the driveway. "This is your final warning," she said loud enough for phones to come out. "You were told." My guest asked one question. "Calm, clear. Under what authority?" She laughed. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said. "This community has rules." He nodded once. "That's what I thought." That was when she swung. The sound of metal collapsing echoed off the houses. Chrome shattered. Glass skittered across the concrete. She swung again, harder, like each strike was meant to prove something she was losing. Neighbors shouted. Someone yelled to stop. No one stepped in. She raised the bat a third time. "That's when I called 911. She saw the phone and smiled. "Good," she said. "Let them come." She took one last step back, bat still in her hand, breathing hard, triumphant, like she'd finally forced the confrontation she wanted all along. Sirens cut through the street less than a minute later. She didn't run. She didn't drop the bat. She squared her shoulders and waited, confident that paperwork, volume, and position would carry her through like they always had. The cruisers pulled in fast, doors opened, an officer raised a hand and told everyone to freeze. Elaine started talking immediately. And that was where escalation ended, because what happened next didn't belong to the HOA anymore. The officers moved in fast and clean, splitting the driveway into lanes like they'd done it 1,000 times before. One officer stepped between Elaine and the truck, hand raised, eyes locked on the bat. Another angled toward my guest, calm, open stance. Elaine didn't pause. She talked over them. Voice sharp, practiced, carrying the confidence of someone used to winning by volume. "This vehicle is prohibited," she said, stabbing the air with the bat. He ignored written warnings. "I'm enforcing HOA bylaws." The officer asked her to put the bat down. She didn't. "I have authority," she insisted. "This is private community enforcement." Phones hovered everywhere now. Neighbors stood frozen in doorways. No one knew which way this was about to break. The officer turned to my guest. "Sir, can I see your ID?" Elaine smirked and folded her arms, already nodding. This was familiar territory. Statements, documentation. The moment where things slowed down and control drifted back to her. My guest handed over his license without a word. The officer looked down, paused, looked up at him, then back down again. Something shifted. Not dramatic, subtle. A change in posture, a tightening around the eyes. "Stand by," the officer said quietly into his shoulder mic. Elaine laughed, dismissive. "See, this is HOA business." The officer didn't answer. He waited. Another cruiser pulled in hard behind the first. The officer with the radio spoke again, slower, now more deliberate. He handed the license to his partner. The partner read it once and straightened like someone who'd just stepped onto ice. The questions changed. Not about parking, not about rules. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning fully toward Ella. "Did you strike this vehicle with that bat?" She scoffed. "Yes, it was a violation." "Did you cause this damage intentionally?" "Of course," she snapped. "That's enforcement." The officer nodded once like he was checking boxes. A neighbor stepped forward. Phone held steady. The video played without sound. The bat rising, the swing, the metal collapsing. Another clip followed. Then another angle. Elaine started talking faster, stacking explanations, citing sections, trying to rebuild control out of words. The officer raised a hand. "Please stop speaking." He turned back to my guest and read the name on the license out loud carefully, and just to confirm, he said, "You are the current district attorney for this county." My guest nodded once. No announcement, no reaction. The street didn't explode. It went silent. Elaine's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The confidence drained out of her face in real time. "No, this isn't," he never said, she stammered, stepping back. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer cut her off. "Ma'am, you are being detained for criminal mischief and destruction of private property." She turned sharply toward the HOA board members who'd gathered at the edge of the driveway. "You approved this," she said. You saw the letters. They didn't answer. They didn't meet her eyes. The bat slipped from her hand and hit the pavement with a hollow clack. The officer guided her wrists behind her back. The cuffs closed with a sound that carried farther than the sirens had. She protested louder now, claimed harassment, intimidation, abuse of power, right up until the officer read her rights and the words tangled in her throat. My guest stayed silent. He didn't correct anyone, didn't explain, didn't claim anything. He didn't need to. As Elaine was led toward the cruiser, phones followed her. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet for years finally stepped forward, filming openly. She looked back at me once, eyes wide, not angry anymore, realizing not that she'd lost authority, but that the protection she'd relied on, the system she thought would bend, had vanished in front of everyone she'd trained to stay quiet. The cruiser door shut, and with it, the HOA's grip on this street snapped clean, public, and irreversible. No one rushed to fill the silence after the cruiser door shut. The engine hummed. Red and blue lights still washed over the houses, but the shouting was gone. The street felt oddly exposed, like a room after furniture had been dragged out. People stood there unsure where to put their hands, their phones, their eyes. Then someone stepped forward, then another. Apologies came out sideways, awkward, unpolished. A man admitted he'd paid fines he never believed were legitimate because it was easier than fighting. A woman said her contractor stopped answering calls after being threatened with towing months ago. Someone else confessed they'd watched enforcement happen before and told themselves it wasn't their problem. No one made speeches. No one tried to justify it. They were just talking now. For the first time, I stayed where I was, letting it pass through me. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been bracing every day until I didn't need to anymore. My shoulders dropped on their own. The air felt thinner, lighter. Across the street, the HOA board members stood together, quiet, avoiding eye contact. No clipboards, no raised voices, just people who suddenly looked like they'd lost a script they depended on. My guest stood beside me, hands in his pockets, listening without interruption. He didn't reassure anyone, didn't correct anyone. He let the moment belong to the neighborhood, and slowly the street started breathing again. One of the officers returned, voice calm and procedural, as if resetting the tone on purpose. Elaine was being booked for criminal mischief and felony destruction of private property. The damage amount alone pushed it there. The videos made intent impossible to argue. My guest spoke quietly for the first time since the cuffs went on. No special handling, he said. Process it normally. The officer nodded. No surprise, just acknowledgement. He continued explaining that additional charges would be reviewed by the county in the coming days. Intimidation, abuse of authority. The HOA's enforcement actions tied to the invalid bylaw would be suspended immediately pending investigation. Then he added something that landed heavier than the rest. The association may be subject to a financial audit and state oversight. That word audit moved through the board members like a cold draft. The officer clarified that any fines issued under the invalid rule could be refunded with interest depending on findings. Towing authorizations would be frozen. Future enforcement would require county verification. No threats, no drama, just consequences delivered clean. Elaine didn't say a word as she was guided into the cruiser. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, finally quiet. Whatever certainty had carried her this far was gone. The system she'd used to corner people had turned inward, and it wasn't listening anymore. The tow truck arrived after the police left, but not to enforce anything. It came to help. The driver worked carefully, sweeping glass, securing straps, treating the damaged pickup like something worth protecting. The metal was still bent where the bat had landed. Evidence of how fast control had turned into panic. My guest watched the truck get loaded, expression unreadable. A board member approached hesitantly, clearing his throat. The signage, he said. The postings, we'll take them down tonight. My guest nodded once. Good. Another neighbor asked, almost afraid to, if contractors would be safe to come back now. They will, one of the officers said from his cruiser window before pulling away. When the street finally cleared, it was just me in the driveway again. No stickers, no bat, no shouting. I stood where Elaine had stood earlier and looked down the block. Same houses, same trees, same street. but the balance had changed. Not because someone powerful showed up to save the day, but because someone tried to abuse authority and found a limit in public. My guest shook my hand before leaving. No speeches, no promises, just a look that said, enough had been done. As the quiet settled back into place, one thing was clear. The HOA still existed, but it no longer owned the silence. Like, share and subscribe. HOA battle.